the question I kept thinking in the back of my mind that I don't have a perfect answer to is, why this argument isn't obvious to people, why the discussion is so non-reality based, why we can't even do a cost-benefit calculation, why do we have a debate where you only talk about the costs and not about the benefits, or and I can come up with accounts of history of how this has gotten deranged. It's somewhat of a mysterious question where we should be using more fossil fuels, we should be using a lot more energy generally, we should be having an economy that's growing in which there's more prosperity and more human flourishing. And then, it's always hard to know exactly where we are in these things, and I always believe in the power of human agency, but at the same time it feels like we're not exactly winning this debate in a crushing way. And so there is something very odd about the merits of the argument versus the insanity of the politics. I often, just to put it in somewhat larger context, I often think I was an undergraduate at Stanford in the late 1980s, where I think probably the best major you could have majored in was computer science. It was not even an engineering field. It was that was sort of for people who found electrical engineering way too hard, who weren't that good at math. That's what you sort of like. It was kind of this not that sophisticated major, definitely not an engineering field. But in retrospect, all the engineering fields, if you had majored in engineering, that was a bad mistake. I was sort of class of '89 undergrad. Electrical engineering sort of had another good decade, but wasn't great. Certainly aeroastro, nuclear engineering, these were catastrophic. That was already obvious to people in the 1980s. But mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, all the sort of areas that have to do with the engineering, the science, the technology of atoms was, they all sort of went sideways, and it's sort of it's a sort of a strange question when this happened. The narrative I like to tell is that somehow the 1970s was the decade where there was a big turning point, where we landed on the moon in July of 1969, and Woodstock started 3 weeks later. And with the benefit of hindsight, that's the point at which true progress stopped, and the hippies took over the country. And I sort of map, all these different things to, a shift to, a shift from exteriority to interiority, where it is about yoga, meditation. There was a way in which the world of bits, it can be both. It can be about the external world. There's a lot of it where it's this alternate internal reality, and somehow this escape to interiority was the thing that happened to a large extent. And then the world of atoms became more and more regulated in all these ways, and somehow the energy field is perhaps the one that's the most important single one in the world of atoms, and it's striking how that's been sort of self-sabotaged over the last 50 years.
You mentioned Apollo and then Woodstock, and big Ayn Rand fan, and she had this essay, Apollo and Dionysus, back then, which was showing the contrast. And I think one gift that we have is that when we had this modern anti-human environmental movement emerge, it was actually pretty explicit that people were looking for a new issue when communism was failing globally. And the way Ayn Rand put it, and I thought this was really insightful with the new left, is the old left said, we're for industry, we're for progress, and we're for socialism because socialism will get us there. And then it was clear that socialism/communism got you the opposite, and they had this basic choice. Do you embrace capitalism because you want industry and progress, or do you keep on with socialism because you don't really care about those? And her point was a lot of the left just embraced socialism and rejected progress, and they did it with this issue of environment. But it was an explicit strategy. And what happened, I think, is that you had a lot of political machinery and resources went into promoting this very primitive environmental philosophy. I think the core of it is that human impact is bad and human impact is self-destructive. So one is the goal of eliminating impact, it's bad, and then the delicate nurture, it's going to destroy us. So this view had always existed, and certainly exists in various forms in primitive religions and this kind of thing. But it really got just promoted everywhere with all of these allegedly scientific, catastrophes that didn't happen. But it was like this primitive philosophy got so much backing behind it that it penetrated the schools and eventually penetrated the media. and including the minds of scientists, and it's this huge tragedy. But I think a reason why it was successful, not just there were certain bad forces behind it, but because they co-opted the issue of a good environment. And human beings care so much, particularly when we're wealthy, about having a good environment. And the left, the anti-capitalist left, really owned the idea of being for a good environment. But what the leaders meant is an unimpacted environment, which is a bad environment for humans. But they packaged together the idea of an unimpacted environment and a good environment. So the idea is if you're with the green movement, you love beautiful parks and you love clean air and you love clean water, and no one wanted to be against that. And I think one of the failings of the pro-capitalism side was to not link capitalism with a really good environment. And so one thing I'm trying to do in Fossil Future is fix that and say that if you're for industry, you're for a good environment for humans. And Peter, I really appreciate the compliments, but one of my hopes is that when people read this book, it'll change a lot more than it's changed so far.
One of the other paradoxes is the way I would tell the history of energy is that it was towards ever more intensive modalities. So it was from wood to coal, which has more energy per unit, and then coal shifted to oil, which was much more intensive. And then the higher intensive things were in some ways actually less impactful on the environment. You don't need to cut down a whole forest to provide the electricity for a city or something like that. You need less impact. And in some sense, the energy of the 21st century was supposed to be nuclear power, which is even more intense, even less impact. And instead, it's sort of regressed. Even oil to natural gas is more diffuse than oil, so it's a little bit of a regression. And then, of course, solar and wind are massively regressive. If we think of them in terms of environmental impact, they're to produce enough solar panel, maybe you have to panel over the whole half the country or something like that, or you have all these ugly windmills everywhere, which are much more impactful on the environment. And then, of course, as you point out in your book, there are all these places where the environmentalists don't want to build solar panel or windmills because they're more impactful in a bad way than these other things. So all of this stuff, it weirdly doesn't make sense, and that's why a lot of it comes back to this sort of anti-human philosophy or something like this. But yeah, it's just gone in very, very strange ways.
But just one final thing. Sorry, Chris, I'm being bad guest. But the thing is. So the way I think of it is that the purpose of energy is to impact our environment. So it's definitely true that the more dilute forms of energy, the production of a given unit of energy is more impactful. But the consequence of having more cost-effective energy has more overall impact because it changes the world. So you have this quote from some of these environmental leaders saying, like, giving a totally clean, cheap source of energy is like giving an idiot child a machine gun. So I think the core aversion to energy among the leaders is not that the process of producing it is dirty, but that the use of energy impacts the world. So that's my account of the hostility. And then with nuclear, which is such a tragedy, which we may get into more, it's that the way we impact nature, even though it has much less impact objectively in terms of anything negative, they think of it as unnatural. Like, it's wrong for us to split the atom. It's wrong for us to create waste that'll add a long time. So I do think there is a certain consistency to it, but I do think that consistency is an anti-human consistency.